Hi everyone. My name is Whitney Sales, as you guys all know. And as Kara mentioned, like I really want this to be interactive. I am basically talking at myself right now. If you guys have questions, I want to make sure this is highly valuable for you. And the more interactive and engaging it will be, your questions will be relevant to other people in the audience. And so you guys will actually get more out of this time if you guys are asking your questions. Don't be shy. I really want to encourage you not to be shy. The other thing I want to ask just before we get started is what stage of company am I talking to? Are you guys 1 to 5 customers? Are you 10, 5 to 10? Are you 10 to 25, 25 plus? It's going to tell me a little bit on how to structure the conversation and how to use the information that I'm going to present today. So if you guys could just drop that in the chat quickly. ACV is really is also a helpful item if you guys can have a chance. So are you, selling SMB, mid-market, or enterprise? And depending on how much time we have, I can go through 2 decks. I'm going to go through the one that everyone needs and uses. And then if we have more time, I'll go through my second deck, which is more strategic, but I'm going to focus on tactical today. Pre-seed, pre-revenue. Okay, cool. So we're looking pretty early stage. So that's great. Great. Okay. Awesome. Thank you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. You guys seeing my screen? Yep. Okay, cool. So just a little about me, now that you guys shared a little bit about you. So my background is in early stage SaaS. So I've worked as an early stage salesperson and an early stage sales leader numbers of times within organizations. And then ran a consultancy for several years, which I still do some advising work on the side. And I'm probably going to be digging back more into that with some teaching that I'm going to be doing over the next year. But and I'm working on a book as well. So hopefully, if you guys like it, please go ahead and comment on some of the stuff we're going to go over. I've worked when I was working for companies and when I was actually working as an operator, I actually launched about 6 products when I was at organizations. And then when I was advising companies, the last company I actually advised before I joined Acceleprise, we were $1 million in ARR in about 8 months. So rapid growth is really my wheelhouse. When I was working in organizations, I had 4 companies on the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies list. First product I ever launched, we actually hit our annual targets in 3 months. So it's the name of the game. I love rapid growth. It's kind of, it's a puzzle to me and it's really fun. And specifically working with founders on driving rapid growth in their organization, early stage hiring, all of those things for scale. And so please ask any questions you have around this. This is going to be focused on more tactical advice that you can just take and apply the next day. But if you have questions around hiring, any type of sales operational type questions, feel free to drop them in. I'm going to leave some time afterwards to make sure that you guys get your questions answered. So I'm happy to jump into those as well after I go through the presentation. Okay, cool. So with that, in the early days of a company, the most important thing that you can build with your customer is trust. And because if you can build trust with your customer, the keynote on this is that your customer will actually tell you everything you need to know in order to sell to them. And what I mean by that is it's about asking the right questions and framing the problem in the customer's mind in a unique way as an early stage founder. It's different than when you're scaling an organization. So if you've worked in sales before for an established brand, working at early stage is a little bit different. And I'm going to talk I'm going to talk today about how you should structure conversations and some of the key things to touch on. And I do have an article series that's going to be coming out after this that actually gives you like really tactical advice on a deck and visuals that can go along with this as well. Okay, so structuring a qualifying call. The reason I focus on a qualifying call is it really is setting the groundwork for everything you're going to be doing in the sale. It frames the problem. You're establishing a champion within an organization. This framework can be used basically if you're looking at like 20K deals and above. If you're selling in the SMB, you're going to be doing more of a distributed relationship. So these are going to be more BD partnerships, and this can be used for those business development relationships as well that you'll be using for distribution. So generally, this is how I like to structure my qualifying conversations. So the first thing I'm actually doing in the call is I'm setting context for the conversation. So as a person who's selling an organization, it's really important for me to be able to control the conversation and structure it the way I want to structure it. You can end up with really dominant personalities on the call, especially if you're selling to the C-suite and CXOs. So establishing context and framing the conversation is really, really important to do that, especially when you have multiple buyers involved in the conversation. Next is why we're even on the call in the first place. So this is anchoring and framing the problem in the customer's mind, and then understanding how that problem relates to the customer specifically. Then I'm going to dive into what it is that we do, and framing it in relation to the customer's problems once I've uncovered those problems. And then from there, I'm going to understand how they're going to buy. So sales is two things. It's problem solving and it's project management. And I'll kind of dive into both of those and how you understand both of those within the organization and the structure of this call. And I see some things popping up here. So Kara or Kate, feel free to interrupt me at any point if there are questions and just jump in here. Cool. All right. So I like to start every conversation with a laugh. Specifically because, and a lot of people skip this, especially if, no offense, but if you guys are product experts or engineers, it's really important to establish a personal relationship with someone, and laughter actually builds trust. It forces the customer to drop their guard, or your prospect to drop their guard. On top of that, it actually stimulates their neural activity. So you're literally making the other person smarter when they're talking to you. Hopefully that's a good thing. And some things that you can do for this, and it also builds positive emotion and makes someone want to get back on the phone with you. If you guys have ever interacted with salespeople, which most of you have at some point in time, the people you always like to work with are the ones that you have fun with. And so it's about having a little bit of fun with your customers and getting to know them on a personal side too. And this is especially important in the early days because they're not buying from your brand, they're buying from you. Some ways to do this: making fun of yourself. Don't put yourself down, but for example, I talk very quickly. I know I do. And so since I've known that since the beginning, I'll talk about the fact I'm wired on coffee, or I've had too much coffee during the day. I'll also make fun of my last name because it's sales and it's very cheesy. But in that as well, I also learned if someone asked if my last name was actually sales, I knew they were in a buyer mindset. So it's kind of fun. It was the first buying signal I actually got from an individual. So there's some information you can garner from people in just this piece, the building rapport piece of a conversation. And people forget this. That's why I make sure to mention it. Next up, I want to go into introductions. So this is especially important when you have multiple people in the room. But as an early stage startup, one of the things you're doing in the early days is you're trying to map what your ICP looks like, your ideal customer profile. And titles these days don't align to the same responsibilities in an organization. A VP at one company can mean something completely different than VP at another organization, depending on size, industry, whether they're a dev-focused org or a sales-focused org. So understanding each person's name, title, and responsibilities is incredibly important. The other thing in here, talk a little bit about how you're connected. If you got an introduction to someone, really important to understand the context of that relationship. Is it someone that they see as credible? Is it someone who was just passing along an intro? Did they download a piece of content? What piqued their interest about their content? Is there anything they were looking to get out of the call? And then finally, confirm how much time you have. Sometimes people will say they have a half an hour. They actually, even though you scheduled an hour, and because they don't think it's going to be a relevant conversation for them, but then they may end up extending it an hour if they're interested because they have the time blocked on their calendar. So it can be a really good buying signal for you, or a negative buying signal for you. The other thing I like to do and mention on this is take notes about individuals' responsibilities. So this is your qualifying call. This is where you're establishing your champion with it, who's going to help you navigate the organization. But after this will be your stakeholder meeting. You may have multiple people on the champion call. It may just be one person. But in your stakeholder meeting, you're going to have multiple people on that conversation. And it's really important to take down their responsibilities. So when you touch on something that's relevant to them, especially in this type of format that's virtual, you can call out the person's name when you're talking about something that's going to be relevant to make sure they're engaged. So it's a really good way to keep people engaged and engage them in a conversation. And then on top of that, based on how people are asking questions, if you have junior people driving a lot of the questions, it's usually going to be a consensus-based org and how they make decisions. So you're going to be doing more of a bottoms-up selling model. If you have another person on the conversation who's really dominating a lot of the questions, it might be a top-down based org. Or if you have a technical person asking a lot of the questions, it might be a development-based org. And so they're going to be, you're going to need to dig in with the developer a bit more and probably schedule a follow-up call. So it's going to tell you a lot about the dynamics of an org. And if you don't write down those responsibilities and understand who's asking questions, you're going to lose that nuanced detail that can be really critical. Also, as a startup, those details can be really important as you start to map your buyer personas to the topics as you start to develop your content long-term. So writing down your objections and questions after sales calls is really, really important at early stage because it's going to help you a lot with scale.
Awesome, Whitney. We have a couple questions coming in. Yeah. So the first one was, do you have differing tips for having qualifying calls over Zoom versus the phone?
Yeah. So qualifying calls over Zoom, rapport is even more important than it is in person, because in person, you're going to have a lot of the nonverbal cues. Make sure video is turned on if you can and set expectations that you'd love to have video turned on. I do actually like to send decks ahead of time for Zoom meetings versus in-person meetings. To give people a little bit of context and education. It's also a good buying signal if they review the information before they talk to you and come prepared with questions. The other thing I do, names are really important. So knowing people's, like I said, that writing down people's names is even more important in a virtual format because it's so much easier to check out. Not to call you out, Kate, but I saw Kate turned off her video. I mentioned her name. She turned it back on. It's that kind of things, those kind of things. And it's not that I have any issue with Kate turning this off. You can completely tune me out. You've heard this presentation 3 times. But it's that kind of detail that could be really important. Where if you're talking to something really relevant, it's a lot easier to tune out on a Zoom presentation than it is in person. Because when you're in person, you're face to face. And if you have an extrovert, they're going to be engaged. But if you have an introvert, again, like it's very easy to pull up your email and start answering emails in the middle of a meeting when you're on Zoom. So if you call out someone's name when you're talking about something relevant, you're going to get their attention and they're going to be paying attention during that period of time. So it's particularly helpful, that particular piece in the introduction and mapping responsibilities to names is really, really helpful. And that's probably one of the big things for me. Also, make sure you look good. Those kind of things. Polish is really important. I understand it's easy, especially right now. It's a huge mental health crisis and, not everyone's motivated to look good every day. But making sure you're polished, making sure you have visuals to what you're talking about, as opposed to just being a talking head. That can be really important for a deck. Those are some of the tips I have.
Okay, awesome. We'll just do one more before you get going again. So do you have any specific, or do you have a specific system for tracking and organizing the information you're gathering during these calls?
So I actually don't, but it's also because I use that for me, I noticed if my notes were scattered afterwards, it meant that the person wasn't an educated buyer. So these were things that I actually learned very early on, just around myself and how I operated. But if my notes were super organized, I knew I had an educated buyer because they took me through their framework and decision making. So I actually didn't like to organize my notes, but you can definitely do so. Winning by Design has something, I think the framework is called SPICE. There's another one, like there's a bunch of stuff like Champ, Bant. There's a bunch of different frameworks that you can use. A lot of it depends on the type of sell you're doing. But you're looking for responsibilities, you're looking at pain per person, and then you're looking at like the role that they're going to play in the cell are the really critical pieces. And then finally, the decision-making criteria. And so we'll get into this a little bit. But that's actually a really good question. And if I were to noodle on it a little bit, I can put something together from a worksheet perspective. Give me a couple weeks, but if you follow me, add me on LinkedIn or follow me on LinkedIn and I'll get something out. Cause that's a great question. And I can very easily put something together. So any other questions, Kara?
There's a bunch more. Do you want to keep going and I'll stop you again after a few?
Oh, okay. Sure, we can do that. So agenda. So next up, what I'm trying to do with my agenda is actually set up the framework for the call. So one of the things that happens a lot of the time when you're selling for the first time and you haven't sold before is either you're just going to pitch your product and say, so you think that's something you're going to use, or you're going to fire off a bunch of questions at your customer and they're going to get super defensive. So what you want to do is actually set an agenda that you're going to ask questions. But before you ask the questions, you want to frame the problem in the customer's mind, which we'll talk a little bit about around your founding story. So the way I run my introductions, and there's a script down here at the bottom that I'm just going to read because it has all these pieces in it. So I want to go over a quick agenda for the meeting today. My goal for the conversation is to get a good understanding of how you guys currently do whatever it is that my company does. And then from there, I'd love to discuss how we might be able to help you with that. And if there's a fit, we'll discuss next steps. Sound like a plan? Great. Is there anything in particular you'd like to discuss? One thing I do want to ask is that we make this as conversation versus a pitch. Though I love to hear myself talk, it's much more important for me to make sure this is a valuable time for you guys. So please feel free to interrupt me. If you're dealing with a large group of people, you may not want them to interrupt you. You may pause for questions. And so build those pauses into how you pitch. If you're doing a one-to-one conversation, you may want them to interrupt you because you want to make it more conversational, because that actually builds more trust as opposed to it being more of a professional setting. Cool. Anything, Kara? Do you want to interrupt me? I can just stop at each slide and answer a few questions. Oh, you're on mute.
Absolutely. So another question that came up was, this is a good one. Is there a polite way to end a conversation if it's really apparent there isn't a fit? How should your response change depending on how far into the call you are when you determine this?
Okay. So we'll actually go through this a little bit in qualifying, but the way I like to politely end a conversation is, one, they may be a fit later. And it's really important that a customer trusts that you're not going to waste their time or feel like you're going to push an agenda on them. And so if you see the customer as being a potential fit later, what I would say is, you know what, from what I'm hearing from you, it does sound like there's a couple pieces of the product that you're looking for that we don't currently have. But I know they are on our product roadmap. And I want to make sure if you need this feature set, I would ask, would you be open to me circling back with you when we have them in X period of time? If it's not a good fit, I just call out and say, hey, it sounds like it's probably, like, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's not a good fit for you guys. You tell me, but I'm hearing that you guys need this and our product is really designed for this. If you have a recommendation as a founder or a person in the industry of a tool that might solve that problem, always make a recommendation, because again, that builds trust. It also establishes you as a thought leader in the ecosystem and makes them more comfortable in referring you, and that you're not going to waste people's time. So you might refer them to another company that has that potential solution, or you want to basically just ask for permission to circle back, because that's not going to waste someone's time.
Another question was, how do you handle a situation in which you're connecting better with one team member versus another on the call with multiple people?
Yeah. So when you have a call with multiple people, ideally you have a champion in the room. So I like to, so before I get into a room with multiple people, my ideal scenario is to find someone who is an influencer within the organization, who is going to be kind of a teacher in mentality, or even a skeptic in mentality, which most engineers are, honestly, unless they've moved up into senior roles, who can help me understand the priorities of the org and how the company currently operates in regards to the problem that I solve, so that I have context going into that. If I notice that I'm gelling with someone, I will play off of that energy, but there might also be a competitive dynamic between the two people in the room. So you're going to have to read that a bit. Like, your empathy skills when you're selling need to like get tuned way up. Like, that volume needs to get turned way up, because it's going to tell you a lot about how that organization runs. Someone may not be resonating with you because you might be taking over part of their responsibilities, or it might be because they have an objection that they're not voicing. So I might say like, hey, I know you've been, I noticed you've been a little quiet. If there's someone else, like, did you have any questions that I can answer for you? It's putting attention on that person and making that person feel good. That actually will help start building that rapport a little bit. Because you don't want them to give objections when they leave the room. You want to be able to get that information out while you're still in the room and can actually influence the decision and make sure they have accurate information. So you can potentially address it. So there's some things you can do. One, make sure you're making everyone in the room look good. Two, you want to, if the person's just being quiet, call out that person's name and speak to them about something or ask them a question. And then three, try and sense out the dynamic between the people in the group. It may be that someone's just really quiet and someone's more a senior. If you're resonating more with the more junior person, you want to make sure you're building a relationship with the more senior person. So there's a lot of nuances to the dynamic. It may be that the senior person's delegating it to the junior person and got pulled into the call because they have the budget. It's just, there's a lot of individual nuances in how that can go. But if you're gelling with someone really well, that's great. You can play off of that to try and engage the other person if it seems like a good company dynamic. If it's someone who's just being really quiet on the conversation, they may just be a quiet person. They may be more junior and not want to look bad in front of their boss. It may be that they have objections that haven't been voiced and are going to voice them afterwards. So instead, notice it and say, hey, I noticed you've been a little quiet. Did you have any questions I can answer? Cool. So next up, founding story. So in my founding story, I basically break this down into three core components. And my founding story is the first kind of pitch that I'm going to give of my product. But in the pitch that I'm giving, I'm actually educating the buyer. I'm not selling. So what I'm doing first and foremost is talking about my personal experience that led me to uncover the problem. So I can give an example. One of the companies I worked with was People Data Labs. People Data Labs is a people API, plugs into the back end of software that has people data in it. So think CRM, marketing automation, HRIS, ATS type platforms, and keeps that data up to date constantly. And has employment history, all that good stuff. So the way this whole company came about was, so giving context of what the company is, Sean, the founder, was working on another company, and he sat down with a recruiter. He's looking to hire a mobile developer. Sat down with a recruiter and said, gave the profile of what he's looking for. The woman said she'd get back to him shortly. He, in his mind, being a founder, impatient because you want to get things done quickly, because time is your most valuable asset. He thought end of day. What it actually took was, it took her a week to come back with a applicant, and he'd actually hired someone at that point because he's pretty good at solving his own problems. She was a friend of his at the time, and so he sat down and he's like, no offense, but what took you so long? And he sits down with her and looks at her workflow and notices she has 50 tabs across the top of her screen, has an ATS with out-of-date data, and realizes that the people data in the systems of record that she was using was completely out of date. Turns out 90% of the people data that exists today was actually created in the last 2 years, and the systems that were designed to capture this data, which weren't even designed to capture the nuanced social media data that's even more important these days because it captures the real-time information about an individual, was out of date. And so he realized that, so with that, and the cost that it actually had was, one, she lost the application. Two, she ended up, she was wasting hours a day trying to look up this information and collect it just to provide applicants, let alone reach out to the applicants. And when he dug a bit deeper, turned out like every role for a recruiter took 8 hours, that 50% of the data was out of date. And people, like, I think it was like even 8% of the people in an applicant tracking system were dead. I mean, it's just like some crazy data. So he decided to create People Data Labs, which is an API that plugs into the back end of applicant tracking systems, CRMs, and other people data platforms. So I said 3 to 5 sentences. I can actually tell that story much faster, but I wanted to give you guys some additional context around it. The things that I'm building into this, into the founding story are: one, I'm giving context for, I had a personal relationship with this problem. I realized it, and it's a problem that you have too. I realized what this problem was actually costing. Like, why did the problem exist? What were the trends that actually led to this problem existing? What was this problem actually costing people? And if we were able to keep this information up to date, and why systems didn't work, the current systems didn't work. And if we were able to change that, what could it actually help? Within the organization or the customer that you're solving. So what I'm trying to do is anchor and frame the problem in the people's mind. So I'm giving the trends around data didn't exist. The data didn't exist when these platforms were developed. It's all out of date, costs a ton of time, costs a ton of money, and it's a bunch of wasted resources when it can be completely automated. In that, I'm relating to the problem, I'm giving context for the problem, I'm educating the buyer, I'm framing it and making it a bigger deal than they might have already been thinking it was. After I do this, I want to pause for questions because there's always going to be questions. Cool. I'll pause for questions now. Kara.
So also I wanted to remind people, if you want to ask your questions live, just raise your hand in the chat. And I see Sean has put his hand up, so I'll unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi Whitney, thanks so much for doing this. We always learn a lot from your presentation, so appreciate the time. I have a question from kind of like maybe a higher level, which is, you know, I work at JC Labs and I work with a lot of these early stage companies, and, you know, oftentimes at the beginning, like first couple of customers, we say do really unscalable things. And it's a lot more than just making the sale, but there's a lot of account management and trying to make sure that, like, you know, the stereotype is get the flywheel going. And I wonder, at what point do you know that you're ready to invest in like an actual sales team that is going to be more focused on making calls and closing deals than ensuring the first few customers have a really high quality experience once they're actually onboarded, so that you have that engagement and you can more validate the product and the value prop and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So as a founder in the early days, it's really important to stay close to selling, because the sales conversation are going to help frame your overall go-to-market and your product development. So you don't want to remove yourself from that fully for quite a long time, actually, until you basically are hiring a head of product. However, basically the way I like to think about it, for sales specifically, because it's a CEO's first job is to sell the product. They're like the chief sales officer at the very beginning. They're the chief everything officer, other than development for the most part, in the early days. But the way I think about hiring is when you can set someone up for success is when you should make the hire. So for example, if you're looking, you need to figure out demand generation. Don't just hire an SDR. You as the founder are going to be the best person to figure that out, because you understand the nuances of your industry and have ideally talked to a ton of people in customer discovery and have a ton of relationships as a result. And so you can learn a lot from the potential customers that you've interviewed around how they learn, which is going to be your channels and the language and nuances that they use. And so you take that information and use that to drive demand generation. When you figure out how to get your demand gen engine going, that's a good time to bring in an SDR, because they can take that process and repeat it. Same thing goes for selling. So when you have a repeatable process from a selling perspective, you know what your ICP looks like, from externally to being able to identify them to internal decision makers within the org and have that kind of mapped, how to talk about the product, how they learn. So if you have a full stack sales team versus, you know, an SDR team plus a sales team plus maybe an account management team or a CS team, when you know what that process looks like, which could be 5 customers if you're selling into the enterprise, it could be 10 customers if you're selling mid-market, it could be 100 customers if it's SMB, but you need to know what that sales process looks like and how to set someone up for success, because a salesperson isn't going to solve your sales problem. And definitely don't just go and hire a VP of sales, because they're definitely not going to solve your sales problem. They're just going to you're going to spend a shitload of money on someone that may or may not work out. And they're going to hire a bunch of people that may have the wrong skill set for what you need. So as a CEO, you need to understand what that process looks like and what success looks like and what the skill set you need looks like. Because an enterprise sell is very different from a mid-market sell, which is very different from, kind of an SMB sell. And so you need to know the skill sets that you're hiring for, and how to vet those skill sets. And you're going to be the best equipped if you've done the job. And you should be doing the job, because sales skills are essential as a CEO. You're going to be selling people on HR. You're going to be selling people on pivots. You're going to be selling VCs for fundraising. It's like you're going to be selling a shitload in a lot of different ways throughout your career. Cool. Answer your question?
Yeah. We have, oh, Ishan, sorry about that.
Yeah.
We have another question from Sufi. Sufi, I don't know if you would like to ask in person.
Yeah, I would love to. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Great. Whitney, thank you so much for this. It's so helpful. Regarding your framing story for the founder, our company was originally a B2C company, and the founder story is very tied to the founder's personal relationship with financial instability. We recently pivoted to a B2B2C, and I have noticed that as we frame this from an end consumer standpoint, it's really resonating with the partners, but it's ultimately not framed about their particular problem. And so would you recommend reframing the story despite the fact that it's powerful, it's emotionally resonant? Should it be more directly tied to the partners and their concerns?
Yeah, so if you're selling a B2B2C, you actually need to tie in both pieces. So you're probably just not taking the story far enough.
Okay.
Right? So like this problem exists for consumers, and then when you look at it from a business perspective, this is what it causes within organizations.
Right.
It's just taking that story just one step further.
Makes complete sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So jumping into qualifying, and then we can go into some more questions. I'm just going to do a slide and then answer a few questions, answer a few questions. Okay. So qualifying. So qualifying actually is like the most critical portion of the conversation you're going to have. All of this is going to be important, but qualifying specifically. Qualifying is what sets context and helps you understand what's happening within the organization. The 2 things that I'm trying to do in qualifying are, 1, understand if they are a good customer for me. The criteria I'm looking for if they're a good customer for me are, 1, does this organization and does this person that I'm talking to have the pain and problem that I'm solving for? Ideally, it's actually pain versus like a nice to have or an optimization. 2, are they actually spending money on this? So for example, if it's a very low level problem or tactical problem within the organization, it may be too far removed from the C-suite to understand the cost to the org. And so they might not be spending money on it. And so it's more, you might want to go scale down to smaller organizations because your feature set may not be there to sell at a more strategic level. So it's really understanding, do they have pain? Are they spending money? And what is going on at the organization that is going to drive them to make a decision on this? The second thing I'm looking at is, what is the relevant case study that I can give to this buyer in my use case, which is what I'll use for a demo. If I'm doing demos on the first call, don't recommend it if you're doing an enterprise deal, but we'll talk about that in a second. But what's the relevant use case that I can give this particular customer that it will relate to their particular pain, right? So it's going to anchor it in their mind that I can do what I said I can do. So in this, when I'm going through this, it's kind of the first piece is, are they a good customer for me? It's also, you're looking for decision-making criteria, but you're going to get more of that when we go through the selling questions. But those are kind of the two pieces I'm looking for when I'm asking my qualifying questions. I frame them as open-ended questions that are, talk me through, help me understand. How do you guys currently approach? How do you think about? How do you guys prioritize? So there's a lot of, I'm going to get a lot more information than if I'm asking like, how do you do this? Instead, it's how do you guys approach it? Can you talk me through that process? Right? So it's getting me a lot more contextually rich information, and at the same time making it very detailed and specific, so I can put myself in the shoes of this buyer and understanding how the problem plays out in their day-to-day. When I'm responding to I call them value-based questions, when I'm responding, doing value-based responses, I'm educating the buyer. So with every question that they're asking, I'm responding with things that help lend credibility to the problem that I'm solving for and the market that I'm going after. So yeah, that's something we actually hear a lot. Wow, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Yeah, when we talked to XYZ in the industry, they said something similar. Did you know? Right? So I'm educating the buyer more around the problem and things they may not have been aware of. And also helping contextualize the problem a bit more. And I say in the bottom here, like my tip on this page is that casual competitor name dropping is really helpful in your value-based responses. This is helpful in the US, it's less helpful in Europe because Europe's a little weird sometimes around competitive tools using your product. But I like casual competitor name dropping in this because it lends credibility that I know the industry and that I play in this industry and I'm a tool that like you want to use. And I'm starting to drive that fear factor, a little bit of FOMO, like if I don't do this, I'm going to lose. And so it's a great way to just build that extra credibility for your brand if you talk to another company in the space that they may be aware of. Cool. I'll pause.
Whitney, I had a quick question about that actually, that came up in another conversation. When you're doing that, mentioning a competitor, is there anything that you advise people to be careful about or anything you want to avoid, like when you're talking?
Yeah, you don't want to give like competitive insights in how their competitor is operating, because that actually breaks trust, especially if it's a bigger company, because NDAs are so essential when you're working with them. So you don't want to break trust. You don't want to reveal anything that the customer wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with you revealing. You could say, like, if it's something like, yeah, that's actually something we heard from this group as well, because what you're just saying is like, yeah, I'm talking to other companies in the space. You don't want to give specific information. They may try and ask specific information, be like, and then it's you know, just like for you, trust is really important. So I can't talk about the nuanced details of it, but they're having a similar problem. We're actually starting to work with them, you know, or we're in conversations with them, even if they're not a customer yet. You can say we're in conversations with them as well. Does that answer your question, Kate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
We also had a question from Preeti, and he asked how many cold introductory emails should be sent before you make a cold call, and what do you think of making cold calls without emails?
So it depends on the industry you're selling into, because cold calling, if you're calling into a developer, for example, is an invasion of privacy. Same for VCs. Like your phone, I don't answer my phone, honestly. Like the only people I really answer my phone for are my family and like my closest friends. And if I'm expecting a phone call, I will answer the phone. And if it's someone that I don't want to talk to, it pisses me off. So it really depends on the industry you're selling into. If you're selling into a recruiter, for example, they have to be on their phone every day. They're expecting to take phone calls. If you're selling to a salesperson, they're expecting to take phone calls. If you're selling to an insurance broker, they're expecting to take phone calls. So it's not as invasive because it's the mode of operation that they use. But if someone hasn't opted into being called, it's not the standard for the industry, it can be very invasive and actually hurt your brand to do that. So, and I like cold emails work if you personalize them and you figured out the product positioning. There's a lot of different tools that you can use these days. I there's like FBot5, which is basically like Google Alerts on Reddit, Lobster, and Hacker News that you can use. And then you have more specifics to reach out to a particular individual who's like commented on something. You can use Twitter to find out relevant information based on your size and the size of the group that I'm talking to. Honestly, you want to be personalizing things more than trying to scale them up as much as humanly possible, and read all of the things that you're sending in the context of, if I receive this, would I respond to it? Like, you guys are good gut checks for that. Like, so personalize it, make it relevant, take the time to write something that someone's going to want to respond to, and you're much more likely to get responses. It's not about spamming everyone. It's not about, I mean, there are some things where it's like you want to cover the market, but if you're selling into the SMB, you need a different acquisition strategy than if you're enterprise or mid-market. But if you're enterprise and mid-market at this stage, personalize it. Like, take time, personalize it. You can go and DM them on Twitter. You can go and add them on LinkedIn. There's tons of tools like Cleverly and DuckSoup that'll do like personalized LinkedIn outreach for you. Don't do like the generic LinkedIn shit. Like, don't do it. I'm just going to tell you, don't do it. Compliment someone. Mention something specific about them. But I'm answering the question more contextually because I think it's really important. But go to your customer and where they are. So you need to learn how your customer learns. And that's what they'll respond to. And it may be cold calling if that's the industry you're going after. It may not.
Another question, and you might have mentioned that you're going to go over this, but someone was asking about, should you demo the product on the first call? I know you mentioned no. Could you go into more detail about that?
Yeah. So that's actually where we're at right now. So I'm just going to go through it.
Perfect.
So what I like to do on the first call is I like to tell story. If you noticed here, it's sequenced in a series of questions, story, question, story. Because what I'm trying to do is people emotionally relate to stories and they remember stories. So I want to get the information that is going to be relevant to tell them the right story. So that's what I'm doing kind of in the sequence, like contextually, is what you should be thinking about. And so the reason I don't do demos on the first call is if I need to do a stakeholder meeting, I want to personalize the demo for them because I want to know specifically what I need to show this company in the short amount of time I'm going to have with a large group of buyers in order to make sure that it's super relevant for them. Second thing, if you gatekeep the demo, you can potentially use that for leverage to get the rest of the decision makers on the call. And so you don't you don't want to just give up the goods, basically. Think of it a little bit like a game of I wouldn't say like gin rummy is a good one, but or even poker. Like, you want to give, forget, right? So you want them to progress the conversation forward. Sometimes people are like, well, I need to see the product. I need to see the product. And they will push back on that. You'll get that sometimes. And if that's the case and you're getting that kind of buyer, just give in and show it to them. Just be like, okay, help me understand a little bit, like, what specifically are you interested in regards to the product? And like, I can dive into the areas that I think would be relevant to you. Especially if you're dealing with an engineer. If an engineer sends you a question, just answer the damn question. I'm just going to say that if you want to turn an engineer off faster, is forcing them to get on a conversation they don't want to get on. It's just a lot of learnings over the years. If someone doesn't want to get on a call, just give them the information they want, because they will get really pissed off if you force them to get on a conversation. But there are ways, if you make it a positive conversation and someone that they actively want to engage with, then they will continue to engage with you and have no problem jumping on a call with you. So that's the portion of building rapport and building a positive relationship to start. So case study and demo. So when I am going over a product, I want to show only the portions of the product that are relevant to this individual buyer. So I'm not going to show the whole fucking thing, pardon my language, but like, I'm not going to show the whole damn product. The reason being, you may not have this tiny little button that your competitor has that, you know what, someone thought was nifty and cool. They probably will never use, but because you didn't have it, now you lose the deal, right? You want to show the pieces that you uncovered in your qualifying questions that are going to be super relevant to them and solve the pain points that they have. And I want to do it by telling them how another customer like them in a similar role or with a similar problem set, how you solve that problem. And I have a script for this. If you guys want it, it's literally like fill in the blanks with sentences. I can send it to you afterwards. Go in and message me on LinkedIn. And I know Kate and Kara have this deck and they'll share it with you, but you're also welcome to message me on LinkedIn and I'll share it with you. So when I'm giving this, the other thing that's important to note here is when I can actually, if you know certain personas are going, of the buyers you're talking to or certain industries are going to have a type of objection, like it always comes up in these types of conversations, you can build that into the story when you go through the demo. I say this a lot, but like, I hear that a lot, or XYZ had the same concern. When we started working with them, they actually blank, right? So it's, you can overcome that as part of it, or you can just build it into the story. The same thing goes when you're pitching VCs, right? Like if you know a certain type of VC, if they're a technical VC, they always have this type of objection. Great, build that into your story, is the big thing I'm trying to relay here. Cool. I'll pause for questions if there are any more.
Just a follow up to that, is there anything different you would do with demos and enterprise sales?
Demos and enterprise sales. So the thing so when you're dealing with an enterprise sale, what you're trying to do with a large group of buyers is you need to align the buyers around the KPI that they'll be judging the success of a pilot or the product. It's probably going to be a pilot considering it's an enterprise and they're not going to dive into anything until they know it's an exact fit for them because they don't have to. And you don't have the brand credibility to prove it yet. So more than likely you're going to have to do a pilot. And so you need to align a group of buyers around the KPIs in which they'll be judging the success of that pilot. And so you want to get all the stakeholders in a room. Every single time there's a new person that's added to a conversation, you end up having to go back and requalify, and then you have to go back and realign. So you want to get all the stakeholders in a room aligned around what the goals for the product are, how they're going to be using it, and how they're going to be judging success of your pilot. And so as you do, this is the other thing that pulls back to the introductions, understanding the responsibilities of the people of the room. So as you start to educate yourself in selling, you actually know who to ask for. After you have your qualifying call and develop your champion, you know who to ask to be in that conversation. If there is going to be a security review, ask for that security person to be in that demo call, because security will dig in a lot of areas if they don't understand exactly what it is that the product's doing and how high of a priority it is for the organization, and it will stall your sell so dramatically. So ask for the security person to be in the room if there's going to need to be like an InfoSec review. Is another thing. It's another tip I can give. But the big thing is, as you get more educated, you'll understand who needs to be in that room, and you can ask for it and try and get everyone who'd be involved in the decision-making process in the room, which we will go through how to do when I go through BANT. So I'll go through that a little bit more later.
Awesome. And just to put on your radar, we have about 10 minutes. So if you want to kind of pause on the questions, and then we'll get through this, and then if we have some time.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my selling questions. So my selling questions are, what do I need to understand about the organization to map the ROI for this specific customer? I want to give the customer, the individual that I'm talking to, an ROI story and how it's going to play out in their day-to-day. But I also need to have an ROI story for them to go bring to the other people to get them involved in that to get them involved for a stakeholder meeting, to navigate it through the org. And then the other thing is, here, my computer's being a little funky. Sorry. The other thing I want to do is when I'm going through these questions is I want to dive deep into the pain that the customer has. So when they're telling me about, I need to understand like clearly, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis for this customer with this pain point? And when they're telling me this, I want to get more and more color, because the emotion that I'm going to get out and the details and nuance that I get out actually make the problem bigger for the user to solve. And so what that's going to do, and the way is I do this, or like I said, like, wow, I'm going to use more of the emotional language. Like, wow, that must take a ton of time. Tell me more. It's the same thing when like your best friend's venting about a problem, right? It's not a pitch. I'm not going to like keep pitching like our product will solve that problem. It's like, oh, wow. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, oh, wow. That's a lot of people to be involved. Like how many hours does it take to pull all that together? Okay. That's kind of crazy. Yeah, we hear that a lot. That's pretty similar across the industry. It's still bizarre to me how long it takes to solve things like that. I'm just going to kind of breeze through these a little bit more. Next up, I'm going to go through. So once I understand what that ROI story is going to look like, I'm going to give it to them, right? So how is the product going to impact their business? I'm going to tie it back to what I uncovered in my value-based questions from a selling perspective, and from my qualifying questions. So, and I have another script for this. So it's fill in the blank. So what I would expect to see for your organization, based on what you're telling me, is we can cut down on the, the number of people involved in this by X, Y, Z, and we can reduce the amount of time by Y. And then overall, from a cost perspective, I would look at an overall savings looking like this. You may not know that yet, but you can start crafting that story and understanding it a little bit better. And as you educate yourself in selling, you're going to get a more rich story, and the more rich detail you can get from the customer, the richer this is going to be. So after you do that, pause for questions, because this is where you're going to get either objections or you're going to get implementation type questions. So they're process or value oriented questions. Value oriented questions, go back and requalify because you didn't dig into a big enough pain point. If they're process-oriented questions, those are buying signals, and they're trying to understand what it's going to look like to use the product for themselves because they're interested. BANT. So when I'm going through BANT, what I'm looking to do is actually map the buying process. You may do this earlier in the conversation versus later in the conversation. So you may be putting in questions like, how do you typically evaluate tools like this? You might put that much earlier. I put these later from a training perspective because it's a lot easier for people to ask these questions once they identify that there's a good fit. It's a lot more comfortable for buyers to do. But generally, this is, you can ask these at the end. You can ask them anywhere, really. It's just about making it conversational as opposed to like, tell me about this thing. So some questions for budget I like. How do you typically evaluate tools like this? Is this something that you guys have allocated resources towards? With budget, you need to be looking at technical implementation just as much as you're looking at financial cost. Authority, is there anyone else who would need to see the product or be involved in the decision-making process? What's their role? What do they care about? This is in case you miss people within the org. And if they'll list off a few people and for the next call. And what I'll say in that is I'll start asking, I'll say, if I want some additional people involved, I might say, would it be possible to pull in security as well? I've found that it's actually much more helpful to have them on the conversation so they understand the role that this product's going to play within the org, so they know how to vet it better from a security perspective if you guys have a security review, things like that. Timeline, have you ever purchased a tool like this before? What was the process like? What I'm trying to do is mentally understand what's going to happen after I get off the call with this individual, and what they're going to be doing, so that I have my homework, they have their homework, and I understand how long it's going to take and the nuances of all the things that are going to happen within the organization as much as humanly possible. And you're going to get more information once you get into the stakeholder meeting, but this one's, you're just going to try to get as much color to it and as much detail as you can in mapping the decision-making process and how they're making a decision and their decision-making criteria and what that whole process is going to look like and time it's going to take and resources it's going to take, et cetera. After you fully understand it, repeat it back. You'll get additional detail because they might have missed something. You might not have heard something. It's the same thing when you're talking to a VC and you ask them, what does your process look like, right? You want to understand the step-by-step process so things don't get added in, right? Or you might be able to jump ahead if you understand what their process looks like by adding certain things in or getting them particular information sooner. Finally, next steps. What's going to happen when you get off the call? What's your homework? What's their homework? Confirm. Always confirm and schedule your next call or conversation, because going back and forth via email fucking sucks, to try and schedule something and delays things. So instead, what you want to do, just ask them if this time of day is really, say, okay, I'll plan on circling back with you. They'll say like, circle back with me in 2 weeks. Every fucking enterprise organization says that. Say, great. Is this time of day typically good for you? I'm just going to send over a calendar invite. I'll check in with you a week beforehand. If we need to move it, we can. But at least that way we have a time on the calendar and we're not playing back and forth via email. Save us both some time and your inbox. Most of them are totally fine with that. And then do what you say, and then it gives you another touch point in between the two as well. Okay. I think I went through that really quick. But how are we on time?
You did a great job. We have about 2 minutes. We have quite a few questions that we're missing, so maybe we can follow up with some more information after the event. But I think this probably.
Let me do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Add me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I do a lot of sales tips on Twitter as well. But go in, if you guys have questions, go in and add me on LinkedIn and ask your questions. Like I will get through them. I'm good at responding to people. Give me a few days because today's a really busy day. But feel free to go in and add me. You can DM me on Twitter. You can DM me on LinkedIn. This is my email address for the methodology. I have another one for Acceleprise, but I use them all. They all go to the same inbox. So, but I do prefer LinkedIn or Twitter for direct outreach versus email.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Whitney.
Yeah, my pleasure. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone. We'll post this online and make sure everyone gets a link to it as well.
All right. Great. Thanks again.
Thanks, Whitney.
Bye-bye, Kate.